In the winter of 1878, in a crowded Montana saloon, a drunkard did the unthinkable. He sold his 4 orphaned nieces to settle a gambling debt. The highest bidder was a terrifying mountain giant known only as the Ghost, a man rumors said killed for sport. Everyone thought the girls were dead, but what that scarred stranger built for them didn't just save their lives. It defied every law of the frontier and created a legacy that history almost forgot. This is their story. The winter of 1878 came to Montana Territory like a judge delivering a death sentence. The winter of 1878 came to Montana Territory like a judge delivering a death sentence. It arrived without mercy, without warning, and without any regard for the fragile human settlements clinging to existence in the shadow of the Absaroka Mountains. The wind carried more than snow that season. It carried stories of men frozen solid in their saddles, cattle found standing upright and dead in drifts 20 feet deep, and children who simply never woke up after lying down to sleep in cabins where the fire had died. In the settlement known as Dead Man's Creek, barely more than a collection of ramshackle buildings fighting against the elements, the Rusty Spur Saloon stood as a monument to human desperation. It was not a place where hope lived. It was a place where hope came to die, usually accompanied by cheap whiskey and the particular stench that accumulates when too many unwashed bodies spend too many hours in too small a space. On the evening of December 18, 1878, at approximately 6:47 in the evening, a transaction began that should have ended in tragedy. Inside the Rusty Spur, the air hung thick with tobacco smoke and the nervous sweat of desperate men. The oil lamps cast shadows that seemed to move with malevolent intent. The pot-bellied stove in the corner glowed red, but provided warmth to only those lucky or ruthless enough to claim the chairs closest to it. At a corner table as far from the stove as possible sat Phineas Thorne. He was a small man, weasel-faced with watery eyes that darted constantly around the room like a trapped animal searching for an escape that did not exist. His hands shook as he stared at the cards spread before him on the stained felt. The trembling was not from the cold. It was from the absolute certainty of his own ruin. Behind him, huddled together like sheep awaiting the butcher's knife, stood the O'Malley sisters. Margaret was 20 years old, though her eyes held the weariness of someone who had lived twice that long. She stood with her back straight, her hand clamped firmly on the shoulder of 17-year-old Beatrice. Sarah, 14, stood with her arm wrapped protectively around 6-year-old Clementine, whose face was buried in Sarah's ragged skirts. The child had stopped crying hours ago. There were no tears left. They wore faded calico dresses that offered about as much protection against the Montana winter as a spider's web would offer against a grizzly bear. Their coats had been sold by Phineas 3 towns back for a bottle of gin. Their shoes were cracked and leaking. Margaret's feet had been numb for so long she could no longer remember what warmth felt like. Across the table from Phineas sat Dutch van der Linde, not the famous outlaw of the same name, but a localized brute who ran the mining supply racket with an iron fist and a complete absence of conscience. He was a thick man, built like a bull with a gold tooth that glinted in the lamplight whenever he smiled. He smiled often. It was never pleasant. Dutch slapped his cards down on the table with the confidence of a man who knew he held all the power. A full house. Kings over sevens. He leaned back in his chair, which creaked under his weight, and gestured toward the pile of chips in the center of the table. "I call." Dutch said, his voice carrying easily through the suddenly quiet saloon. Every conversation had stopped. Every eye had turned to watch. Phineas stared at the cards. His own hand was pathetic. A pair of 2s. Nothing else. The pile of chips represented everything he had left in this world. His wagon already half broken, his mule already half dead, and the last $20 from his dead sister's inheritance, the sister who had left him the care of her 4 daughters before dying of consumption in a charity hospital in St. Louis. Well, Dutch leaned forward, his meaty hands spread flat on the table. "Pay up, Thorne, or we take it out of your hide." The threat was not empty. 2 of Dutch's men stood behind him, hands resting casually on the pistols at their hips. In Dead Man's Creek there was law and there was justice, and the two rarely had anything to do with each other. Phineas swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed in his thin neck like a cork in choppy water. "I don't have the cash, Dutch. You know I don't." Dutch reached for the Colt Navy revolver on his hip. The motion was slow, deliberate, designed to maximize fear. "Then you're a dead man." "Wait!" The word burst from Phineas like a gunshot. He lurched to his feet so quickly that his chair clattered to the floor behind him. The entire saloon went silent. Even the piano player stopped mid-chord, his hands frozen above the yellowed keys. "I have assets," Phineas said, his voice climbing toward hysteria. "Valuable assets." He turned and grabbed Margaret by the arm. She resisted, digging her heels into the sawdust-covered floor, but Phineas was a man fighting for his life now, and desperation provided strength that his scrawny frame normally lacked. He yanked her forward with surprising force. "Look at them!" Phineas shouted to the room, his spittle flying. "4 of them, young, strong. They can cook, they can clean, they can do whatever you need." The words hung in the air like a curse. For a moment nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The fire in the stove seemed to dim. Even the wind outside seemed to pause, as if nature itself recoiled from what was happening. Margaret's face went pale as winter snow. Her lips moved, but no sound came out at first. When she finally found her voice, it was barely a whisper. "Uncle Phineas." "No." The word uncle was a formality. He was her mother's brother. He had taken them in after their mother died, but only because he thought there might be money. When he discovered there was none, the 4 girls became nothing more than burdens, mouths to feed, problems to solve. "Shut your mouth, girl," Phineas snapped. He raised his hand and struck Margaret across the face. The sound echoed through the saloon like a whip crack. Clementine began to wail, a high-pitched keening that sounded less human than animal. Dutch looked the girls over with the calculating eye of a man appraising livestock. A slow, predatory grin spread across his face, revealing that gold tooth again. But before he could speak, a voice cut through the noise. $50 for the lot, for the brothel upstairs. It was Madame Rose, the proprietor of the Rusty Spur. She descended the stairs with practiced grace, her silk dress rustling. She was a handsome woman in her 40s, hardened by years of survival in the West. Her establishment occupied the 2nd floor of the saloon. Everyone knew what kind of establishment it was. "They're skinny," Madame Rose continued, circling the girls like a buyer at a horse auction. "But I can fatten them up. The youngest will fetch a premium in a few years. Certain men pay well for that." Margaret felt the bile rise in her throat. She looked around the room, her eyes pleading with anyone, everyone for intervention. The sheriff was passed out at the bar, his head resting in a puddle of spilled whiskey. The miners looked away, some ashamed, others indifferent. This was the frontier. This was how things were. A man's property was his own business. $50K, Phineas scoffed, though his eyes had lit up with the desperate hope of a drowning man who sees a rope. "They're worth at least 100. Look at Beatrice. She's a beauty. And Margaret here can read and write. Educated." 75, Dutch countered, standing up. His chair scraped loudly against the floor. "I need workers for the mine camp, or entertainment. Either way I can use them." The bidding war had begun. It was a nightmare come to life, a descent into hell that happened in slow motion every second, stretching into eternity. The sisters huddled closer together. Sarah whispered frantic prayers into Clementine's hair, the same prayers their mother had taught them. Margaret's mind raced, searching for options, finding none. She looked for a weapon, a bottle, a knife, anything. She resolved then and there that she would kill the first man who touched them, even if it meant she hanged for it. $100, Madame Rose shouted, her voice sharp. 110. Dutch roared back, slamming his fist on the table. The numbers climbed higher. The room grew louder. Men began to place side bets on who would win. It was entertainment now. A show. The humanity of the 4 girls standing in the center of it all had ceased to matter, if it ever had. Then a new voice entered the conversation. It did not shout. It did not need to. 200. The voice was low, deep, like gravel grinding against steel. It seemed to vibrate through the floorboards, through the very bones of the building. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The double doors at the front of the saloon swung open. A swirl of snow and ice swept in along with a blast of wind that made the oil lamps flicker. Standing in the doorway was a mountain of a man. He had to duck to enter. He was wrapped in a massive buffalo hide coat, the fur frosted white with ice and snow. His face was hidden beneath the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat and a thick dark beard. But even in the dim light, a jagged scar was visible running from his temple down to his jawline, a pale line against weather-beaten skin. He carried a Sharps buffalo rifle in the crook of his arm as casually as another man might carry a walking stick. The rifle was a .50 caliber, the kind used to drop animals weighing a ton from half a mile away. In the close confines of the saloon, it looked like a cannon. The room went deathly silent. Every sound ceased. The fire in the stove seemed to hold its breath. The wind outside stopped howling. Even Clementine's crying stuttered into shocked silence. "That's Jedediah Halt," someone whispered. The name passed through the crowd like a disease. The ghost. Jedediah walked toward the table. His boots thudded rhythmically against the floor, each step deliberate, unhurried, carrying the weight of absolute certainty. He did not look at the girls. His eyes, dark and unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat, were fixed on Phineas. 200, Jedediah repeated. His voice had not changed volume, but somehow it filled every corner of the room. Gold. The word gold changed everything. $200 in gold was not just a fortune, it was a year's wages for a skilled laborer. It was enough money to drink yourself to death 10 times over. It was salvation for a wretched man like Phineas Thorne. Phineas's mouth fell open. He looked at the mountain of a man standing before him, at the gold-toothed smile frozen on Dutch's face, at Madame Rose's calculating eyes. Then he looked at the rifle. "Sold," Phineas squeaked. "To the mountain man." Dutch looked furious, but he did not argue. Nobody argued with Jedediah Halt. The stories about him were legend. Some said he had killed a grizzly bear with nothing but a bowie knife, wrestling it for an hour before driving the blade into its heart. Others said he had scalped 5 bandits who tried to rob his trapline, leaving their bodies arranged in a circle as a warning. The truth was unclear, but the fear was very real. Jedediah reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy leather pouch. He dropped it onto the table with a dull thud. The sound of gold coins clinking together was heavy and final, like the sound of a coffin being nailed shut. "Get your things," Jedediah said to the girls. His voice was devoid of emotion, flat as the winter plains. Margaret found her voice, though it shook. "We have nothing." She stared at him, trying to find a shred of humanity in those dark eyes. She saw nothing but cold resolve, the same kind of emptiness she had seen in the eyes of wolves. "Then move." Jedediah turned and walked toward the door. He did not look back. He did not check to see if they were following. He simply expected obedience. Behind them, Phineas was already clawing at the leather pouch, his fingers fumbling with the drawstring. He poured the gold coins out onto the table, counting them with shaking hands, completely ignoring the 4 nieces he had just sold. Margaret looked at her uncle one last time. It was a look of pure, concentrated hatred. A look that promised retribution if their paths ever crossed again. Then she ushered her sisters toward the door, toward the darkness, toward the unknown. They had been sold to a monster, and now they were walking into the night. The cold hit them like a physical blow. The wind in the foothills of the Absaroka Mountains was merciless, cutting through their thin dresses as if the fabric did not exist. Outside the saloon, Jedediah Halt was tightening the cinch on a massive black mule. The animal stood patiently, its breath steaming in the freezing air. The mountain man did not acknowledge their presence. He simply tossed a bundle onto the snow at their feet. "Put them on." Margaret hesitated. Was this a trick? Some kind of cruel joke before the real horror began? She picked up the bundle. It was a collection of rough-cured wolf and deer hides. They smelled of smoke and animal musk. But when she wrapped one around Clementine's shoulders, the little girl instantly stopped shivering. "Why did you buy us?" Margaret demanded. Her voice was stronger now, fueled by the need to know. She needed to prepare for what was coming. She needed to understand the worst so she could plan. Jedediah mounted his horse, a towering roan stallion that looked as mean-tempered as its rider. He looked down at her, his face unreadable beneath the beard and the shadow of his hat. "You talk too much," he grunted. "Climb on the mule, the little one and the middle one. You and the other walk until you can't." "We're not going anywhere with you until you tell us what you want," Sarah shouted. Her fear was manifesting as aggression, her voice high and sharp. Jedediah stared at her for a long moment. Margaret thought he might strike them. Instead, he pulled his rifle from its scabbard and rested it across his saddle horn. "You stay here, you die. Freeze to death, or Dutch comes back and takes you for free. You come with me, you might live." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Your choice." He kicked his horse and began to move forward, trudging into the white expanse. He did not look back. He did not wait to see if they would follow. He was a force of nature, and forces of nature do not concern themselves with the choices of lesser beings. Margaret looked back at the warm light spilling from the saloon. She could hear her uncle's drunken laughter inside, celebrating his newfound wealth. Then she looked at the dark, hulking shape of the mountain man disappearing into the whiteout. "Get on the mule, Clementine," Margaret ordered. "Sarah, help her. Beatrice, stay close to me." They followed him. The journey became a blur of white agony. They walked for hours, climbing higher into the mountains with each step. The path was not really a path at all, just a deer trail that Jedediah seemed to know by instinct, navigating through darkness and snow with the certainty of a man who had walked this route 1,000 times. The air grew thinner as they climbed, making their lungs burn with each breath. The cold intensified until it felt like knives stabbing into exposed skin. Margaret's feet had long since gone numb. She walked mechanically, one foot in front of the other, her arm linked with Beatrice's to keep them both upright. Jedediah never spoke. He never stopped to check on them. He was like a locomotive, relentless and unfeeling, pulling them along in his wake. When Beatrice stumbled and nearly fell, Margaret caught her, but Jedediah did not even turn around. When Sarah cried out that she could not go any further, the mountain man kept riding. They either kept up or they were left behind. The moon rose nearly full, turning the snow-covered landscape into an alien world of blue-white light and deep black shadows. The trees stood like frozen sentinels. The wind howled through the peaks above them, a sound like tortured souls crying out in the darkness. Just when Margaret thought she would collapse and let the snow take her, just when she thought death by freezing would be preferable to another step, Jedediah stopped. They had reached a small overhang, a natural cave carved into the mountainside by wind and water over countless centuries. It was protected from the wind, deep enough to provide shelter, but shallow enough to avoid the feeling of being buried alive. "Camp," Jedediah said. He dismounted and began to gather wood from a cache hidden beneath a rock overhang. Within minutes he had a roaring fire going, the flames bright and warm and impossibly welcome. He set up a cast-iron skillet over the fire and began frying salt pork and hardtack. The smell of cooking food made the girls' stomachs twist and clench. They had not eaten in 2 days. Jedediah sat on a log eating silently. He did not offer them any food. He simply ate methodically, chewing each bite thoroughly before swallowing. The girls watched him with a mixture of hunger and confusion. Sarah glared at him, her young face twisted with anger and fear. "Are you going to starve us too?" Jedediah looked up a piece of pork halfway to his mouth. He pointed at the skillet with his knife. "It's there. I ain't your servant. You want it, you get it." Margaret realized then that this man operated on a code they did not understand yet. It was not cruelty exactly, it was a brutal indifference. He expected them to fend for themselves. He would not help, but he would not prevent them from helping themselves either. She moved to the fire and dished out portions for her sisters. They ate voraciously, burning their tongues, not caring. The food was simple, rough, but it was hot, and it was sustenance. It was life. After the meal, silence stretched heavy and terrifying between them. The firelight danced on Jedediah's scar, making it look like a fresh wound still bleeding. The shadows made his face seem less human, more like some ancient spirit of the mountains. Clementine, the youngest, her small voice barely a whisper, asked, "What's your name?" Margaret stiffened. "Clementine, hush." But Jedediah looked at the 6-year-old child, and something in his eyes changed. The hardness softened just for a moment, just enough to notice. He stared at her for a long time, as if trying to remember something he had forgotten. "Jedediah," he said finally. "Mr. Jedediah," Clementine said carefully, "are you a bad man? Uncle Phineas said you eat people." Beatrice gasped. Margaret reached out to cover Clementine's mouth, but Jedediah let out a sound that might have been a chuckle or might have been a grunt of pain. "Your uncle is a rat who would sell his own mother for a drink," Jedediah said. "Don't listen to rats." He stood up and threw a heavy woolen blanket toward them. It landed in a heap at Margaret's feet. "Sleep. We ride at dawn. We have 20 miles of vertical climb tomorrow." "Where are we going?" Margaret asked, pulling the blanket over her sisters. Jedediah looked out into the darkness toward the high peaks of the Sawtooth Ridge, barely visible against the starlit sky. "To Devil's Throat," he said. "My home." The name sent a chill through Margaret that had nothing to do with the cold. Devil's Throat. It sounded like the entrance to hell itself. Margaret did not sleep that night. She sat with her back against the rock wall, watching the fire burn down to embers, watching the mountain man who slept sitting up against a rock with his rifle across his lap. Even in sleep he seemed ready for violence. But as she watched, she noticed something. In his sleep his face twitched. His lips moved, forming words she could not hear. His hand, calloused and scarred, clenched and unclenched as if grasping for something that was not there. And then she heard it. So quiet she almost missed it beneath the crackling of the fire and the distant howl of the wind. A name. "Emily." He said it again, his voice rough with some emotion she could not identify. "Clara." 2 names, spoken with a pain so raw it was almost physical. Margaret realized with a sinking heart that this was not just a monster. This was a man haunted by ghosts, tormented by memories. Whatever horror awaited them at this place called Devil's Throat, it was built on tragedy. She pulled the blanket tighter around her sisters and tried to find warmth. They were miles from civilization now, owned by a man who lived in a place called Devil's Throat. But as she watched him sleep, watched the way his face contorted with whatever nightmares plagued him, she understood something important. If they were going to survive, she would need to understand those ghosts. She would need to learn what haunted Jedediah Halt, because haunted men could be predicted. Haunted men had weaknesses, and weaknesses could be exploited. The fire burned low, the stars wheeled overhead, and somewhere in the distance a wolf howled its cry, echoing off the mountain peaks like a warning from the darkness itself. The ascent to Jedediah's home was a test of endurance and a journey into the heart of the forbidding Absaroka Range. For 2 more grueling days they climbed. The landscape grew starker with each mile, the air thinner and colder, until breathing became a conscious effort rather than an automatic function. The mule struggled under its burden. Even Jedediah's powerful roan stallions snorted with effort as they navigated switchbacks so narrow that a single misstep would send them tumbling into oblivion. The sisters pushed beyond any limit they thought they possessed, walking in a haze of pain and exhaustion, their muscles screaming, their minds dulled by the relentless cold and fear. They passed jagged peaks that clawed at the sky like the fingers of giants trying to tear down the heavens. They moved through narrow, snow-choked passes where the wind tried to rip them from the mountain itself. Ice formations hung from overhangs like the teeth of some massive predator. The world had become alien hostile, a place where human life was an intrusion rather than a right. Margaret found herself staring at Jedediah's broad back hour after hour, day after day. A mixture of hatred and grudging respect warred within her. He was a force of nature utterly unyielding, but he was also keeping them alive. When Sarah's legs gave out on the 2nd day, Jedediah did not help her up, but he slowed his pace just enough that she could catch up. When Beatrice slipped on ice and nearly fell, he did not turn around. But he waited at the next bend until she appeared. He fed them every night. salt pork hardtack, sometimes jerky that tasted of smoke and spices. He never spoke during meals, never asked if they were comfortable or warm enough. But he always made sure there was enough food. He always made sure the fire was large enough to keep them from freezing. On the afternoon of the third day, as the sun began its descent and painted the western sky in hues of fiery orange and bruised purple, Jedediah reined in his horse. He pointed with his rifle barrel. There. Margaret squinted, trying to pierce the gathering gloom and the swirling snow. Below them, nestled in a high hidden valley carved into the side of a towering rock face, was a structure that defied belief. It was not a log cabin. It was not a trapper's hovel. It was a fortress. Massive, rough-hewn timbers formed the walls chinked with mud and rock that had been applied with obvious care and skill. The structure was 2 stories high with a steeply pitched roof designed to shed heavy snow before the weight could collapse it. Narrow slit-like windows, reinforced with thick wooden shutters, gazed out like watchful eyes. A sturdy wooden fence, almost a palisade, surrounded a small yard within which stood a stable and a smokehouse. The entire complex seemed to grow organically from the mountain itself, camouflaged by its rugged surroundings, hidden from anyone who did not know exactly where to look. "Devil's throat," Beatrice whispered, awe overcoming her fear for the first time in days. "It's a wonder. It's a fortress." Sarah breathed her usual defiant stance, softening into something approaching wonder. Clementine, who had been riding on the mule for the last few hours, simply stared, her eyes wide as saucers. Jedediah led them down a perilous switchback trail, each step a gamble with gravity and fate. As they drew closer, Margaret noticed details that made her reassess everything she thought she knew about this man. A cleverly designed water wheel fed by a diverted mountain stream. A massive stone fireplace chimney dominating one side of the main building. And most surprisingly, what looked like a well-tended vegetable garden, though now buried under a blanket of snow, the wooden markers poking through like gravestones. This was not just a dwelling. This was a testament to meticulous planning and immense labor. This was the work of years, perhaps decades. This was not the lair of a savage. This was the home of an engineer. Jedediah dismounted at the heavy iron-banded gate which swung inward silently on massive hinges that had been greased and maintained with obvious care. He did not speak, simply gesturing them inside with a movement of his head. The interior of the main cabin was another shock, perhaps the greatest one yet. The air was warm, rich with the smell of pine and wood smoke. A huge stone hearth dominated the living area, a fire already blazing merrily within, suggesting that Jedediah had somehow arranged for it to be lit before their arrival, or that it had been burning continuously. But it was not the rough, crude dwelling Margaret had expected. Polished hardwood floors gleamed beneath their snow-dusted boots. Bookshelves overflowing with leather-bound volumes lined one wall. Margaret's educated eye caught titles: Shakespeare, Milton, Dante's Inferno, engineering texts, medical journals, a Bible well worn with markers and notes visible along the edges. A sturdy oak table large enough to seat 10 people stood in the center of the room, adorned with a clean checkered tablecloth. There were comfortable-looking chairs covered in what looked like cured deerskin. An ornate tapestry depicting a mountain scene hung above the mantelpiece. On a small side table, Margaret saw a delicate porcelain teacup, meticulously clean, sitting next to a silver-framed photograph. The photograph was face down. "Take off your boots," Jedediah commanded, pointing to a mat by the door. "Hang your furs on the pegs." He moved to the hearth and stirred a pot that simmered over the fire. The aroma of rich stew filled the room, making their mouths water instantly. Venison by the smell with vegetables and herbs. "There's water in the bucket by the pump," he said, indicating a hand pump near what appeared to be a kitchen area. "Wash up. Supper will be ready when you're done." The sisters exchanged bewildered glances. This was not the lair of a monster. This was a home, a remarkably well-appointed one at that. It was clean, organized, comfortable. It was civilization in the middle of wilderness. Margaret moved toward the pump, her mind reeling with confusion and questions. As she drew the cold, clear water, she caught sight of another detail that added to the mystery. A meticulously organized workbench in a corner, complete with engineering tools, drafting instruments, precision, measuring devices, and even a small, delicate brass telescope. This man was not merely a trapper or a miner. This man was educated, skilled, cultured even. They washed their faces and hands, the grime of the journey washing away, revealing faces that were still smudged and wind-burned but held a growing sense of disbelief. When they sat at the table, Jedediah dished out generous portions of venison stew thick with potatoes, carrots, and wild onions. He handed them each a slice of warm, crusty bread. They ate in silence ravenously. It was the best meal they had ever tasted, partly due to hunger, partly due to the sheer unexpectedness of it all. This was not starvation rations. This was a feast. After they finished, Jedediah spoke again. "There are 4 rooms upstairs. You each pick one. There are clean clothes in the chest in the master bedroom. Take what you need." He gestured to a door that stood slightly ajar at the far end of the room opposite the kitchen. Margaret noticed, however, that another door, a smaller one next to the workbench, was conspicuously closed and secured with a heavy iron latch and a stout padlock. "What's in there?" Sarah asked, pointing to the locked door. Her curiosity was overriding her caution, as it often did. Jedediah's gaze hardened instantly. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. "That is not your concern. That room is off limits. You will not touch it. You will not ask about it again." His voice was low, dangerous. "Understood." The sisters understood immediately. This was a place of comfort, yes, but it was still his domain. His rules were absolute. That door was a boundary that could not be crossed. Margaret led her sisters upstairs. To their astonishment, the rooms were clean and furnished with simple but sturdy beds, dressers, and even small writing desks. The master bedroom was larger, with a 4-poster bed and a large cedar chest. Inside the chest they found an array of clothing, dresses, petticoats, even sturdy boots, all clearly belonging to women and a child. They were old-fashioned, perhaps a decade out of style, but clean and well-preserved, as if someone had taken great care to protect them from moths and decay. Margaret realized with a jolt that these were likely the clothes of Jedediah's deceased family. The wife and daughter he had murmured about in his sleep. Emily and Clara. That night, for the first time in months, the O'Malley sisters slept in real beds under thick, warm quilts. The mattresses were stuffed with fresh straw and herbs that gave off a faint, pleasant scent. The windows were shuttered tight against the cold and the dark. Margaret lay awake for a long time, listening to the crackle of the fire downstairs, to the wind howling outside, to the soft breathing of her sisters in the adjacent rooms. Escape, she realized, was almost impossible. They were high in the mountains, surrounded by wilderness. The snow was already piling up outside, trapping them as effectively as any prison bars. She looked at the small, sturdy window. Beyond it, the moon illuminated a vast, unforgiving landscape. Miles of nothing. Days of travel to the nearest settlement, if they could even find their way. And winter was only beginning. She was still a captive. They all were. But her captor was not what she had expected. The fortress in the clouds, built by this mysterious mountain man, held more secrets than she could fathom. What tragedy had led him here to this isolated haven? Why had he built something so substantial, so permanent in such a remote location? And what did he truly want with 4 orphaned girls? As sleep finally began to claim her, Margaret's last thought was of the locked room downstairs. Whatever was behind that door held the answers. Whatever grief Jedediah Halt carried, it was locked away in that room. And someday, somehow, she would find a way to understand it, because understanding was survival, and survival was all that mattered now. The Ghost of Absaroka, Part 2, Fire and Steel. The first weeks at Jedediah Halt's mountain fortress were a strange blend of uneasy truce and bewildering routine. The mountain man was not a teacher in any conventional sense. He did not explain. He did not encourage. He simply expected. On their first morning, Margaret woke to find Jedediah already up, standing in the main room with a worn, leather-bound journal in his hands. The fire was roaring. Breakfast was cooking. He looked up as she descended the stairs, her feet still sore from the journey. "You can read, can't you?" he asked without preamble. Margaret, surprised, nodded. Yes, Mr. Halt, our mother Elara taught us. Jedediah merely grunted, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. He handed her the journal. Good. You'll keep the inventory. There's a store of dried meat, vegetables, flour, salt, sugar. Learn what we have. Learn what we need. Winter's long. Running out of food means death. He turned to Beatrice, who had just appeared at the top of the stairs. You, come with me. For the next hour, Jedediah taught Beatrice how to care for the horses and the mule. He showed her how to muck out the stable properly, how to check hooves for stones and cracks, how to groom the animals with a surprising gentleness that seemed at odds with his gruff exterior. He did not speak more than necessary, communicating mostly through demonstration and expectation. Sarah was put to work helping Jedediah maintain the cabin. He taught her how to mend leaks in the roof using pitch and wooden shingles, how to chop wood efficiently to conserve energy, and how to clean his rifles with meticulous care. He was particular about the rifles. Each one had to be disassembled, cleaned, oiled, and reassembled exactly right. A rifle that jams gets you killed, he said simply. Out here, dead is permanent. Clementine, too young for heavy labor, was given the task of feeding the small flock of chickens Jedediah kept in a secure coop behind the stable. She took to it with surprising enthusiasm, naming each chicken and talking to them as she scattered grain. Jedediah himself was a whirlwind of activity. He spent his days checking trap lines that stretched for miles through the mountains, tending to a mine he had carved into the mountainside, the source of his gold, and ensuring the fortress was ready for the brutal winter that was rapidly approaching. He was a master craftsman, a survivalist, and an engineer, repairing everything from the water wheel to a broken clock in the living room with practiced ease. Slowly, imperceptibly, the girls began to shed their fear. It was replaced by a cautious curiosity and a grudging respect. They discovered that Jedediah was fiercely protective of his solitude, but he was not malicious. He simply existed by a different code than the world they had known. He never touched them inappropriately. He never threatened them beyond his initial warnings. He always ensured they were fed and warm. He was demanding but not cruel. He expected work but provided everything necessary to accomplish it. You want to eat, you earn it, he had stated bluntly on that first morning. I don't feed parasites, but I don't work anyone to death either. Fair exchange. That's the law here. One evening, 2 weeks after their arrival, Margaret found him staring at the silver-framed photograph on the side table. He did not realize she was there until she was close enough to see what he was looking at. The photograph showed a woman and a child. The woman was beautiful in a simple, honest way with kind eyes and a gentle smile. The child, a girl of perhaps 5 years old, looked like her mother. When Jedediah looked up and saw Margaret watching, his eyes were clouded with an ancient grief that seemed to age him 20 years in an instant. He quickly turned the photograph face down as if hiding it could hide the pain. "Who was she?" Margaret asked softly, emboldened by the glimpse of his vulnerability. Jedediah remained silent for a long moment. The fire crackled. The wind howled outside. Finally, he spoke, his voice a low growl. "My wife, Emily, and my daughter Clara." "What happened?" The question hung in the air. Margaret thought he would not answer. She thought he would order her to leave to mind her own business, to never speak of it again. Instead, he stared into the fire as if seeing something there that she could not. "Bandits," he said finally. "Like the rats who sold you. They came for the mine. Gold fever makes men into monsters. They thought I kept a fortune here." He paused, his jaw clenching. "I was out checking traps. Came back to find them. Emily and Clara, they'd been—" He stopped, unable or unwilling to finish. The realization hit Margaret with the force of a physical blow. Jedediah Halt had not bought them for nefarious reasons. He had bought them because he saw in them a reflection of his own lost family. He was a broken man seeking to protect what he had once lost, trying to fill a void that could never truly be filled. The locked room, she now surmised, held relics of his past, a shrine to his grief, a place where memories lived because the people could not. "I'm sorry," Margaret whispered. Jedediah stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Don't be. Sorry doesn't bring them back. Sorry doesn't change what is." He walked toward the door, pulling on his heavy coat. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow we start weapons training, all of you." As the weeks turned into months, the first heavy snows began to fall, blanketing the mountains in an impenetrable white. The fortress became their entire world, cut off from civilization as effectively as if they had been transported to another planet. Margaret, always resourceful, found a forgotten loom in the cellar during one of her inventory expeditions. With Jedediah's surprisingly patient guidance, she began to learn to weave using wool from the sheep and hides Jedediah brought in from his trapping. He taught her the basics, then left her to experiment and fail and learn. Beatrice, an avid learner, devoured the books in Jedediah's library. She was particularly drawn to those on natural history and geology. She would read by the fire in the evenings, occasionally asking Jedediah questions. He always answered often at length, revealing a depth of knowledge that surprised them all. Sarah, ever practical, learned to cure meat and dry herbs under Jedediah's instruction. She became the fortress's unofficial healer and provisioner, organizing the stores with an efficiency that earned a grunt of approval from the mountain man. Clementine, no longer crying every night, blossomed under the stability. She was often found sketching animals in a small notebook Jedediah had given her without explanation, just left on her bed one morning with a set of charcoal pencils. The weapons training was serious business. Jedediah did not treat them like delicate flowers. He treated them like soldiers. "This ain't no parlor game, girls," he said, showing them how to load a Winchester repeater rifle. "The West will kill you if you're helpless. Out here, being helpless is being dead. I won't have dead people in my house." They practiced shooting at targets behind the stable. Margaret proved to have a steady hand and good aim. Beatrice was slower but methodical, never wasting a shot. Sarah was aggressive, sometimes too much, so pulling the trigger before fully aiming. Clementine was too small for the rifles, but Jedediah taught her to load them to understand the mechanisms. "Someday you'll be big enough," he told her. "Until then you can help your sisters." But the peace of the mountain fastness was not destined to last. One frigid afternoon in late February, Jedediah returned from checking his trap lines earlier than usual. His face was grim, his movements sharp and tense. He dropped a bloodied rabbit onto the snow outside the door, its neck neatly snapped. "Trouble," he said, his eyes scanning the horizon with the intensity of a predator sensing a threat. Margaret stepped outside, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the cold. "What kind of trouble?" "Boot tracks, not mine, fresh, maybe 2 hours old." He pointed to marks in the snow that Margaret could barely distinguish from natural patterns. To Jedediah they were clear as writing on a page. "A whole pack of them, 6, maybe 8 men, heavy laden, moving slow. They're not trapping rabbits." He went straight for his rifle, checking the action with practiced efficiency. "Likely heard about the mine. Phineas Thorne, that rat, probably babbled to the wrong people in Dead Man's Creek when he was drunk and celebrating his gold. Word travels. Greed travels faster." A cold dread settled over the sisters, heavier than any snowfall. They had escaped one nightmare only to be pulled into another. The sanctuary that Devil's Throat had become was about to be tested. "What do we do?" Beatrice asked, her voice trembling, despite her attempts to sound brave. "We fight," Jedediah said simply. He began loading his Sharps rifle with the calm efficiency of a man who had faced death many times before. "They want my gold. They'll have to take it over my dead body." He paused, then added, "And yours." He looked at them, then truly looked at them, not as burdens or possessions, but as people who shared his space and his fate. "You stay inside, lock the doors, bar the windows. Under no circumstances do you open them unless you hear my voice telling you it's safe." "And if they get in?" Margaret asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Jedediah strapped on a holster with 2 Colt revolvers. He pulled a Bowie knife from his belt, checking its edge. "If they get in, you go to the root cellar. There's a hidden passage there behind the barrels on the east wall. You follow it. It comes out a 1/4 mile down the mountain. You run. You don't look back. You get to Helena if you can. You survive. What about you? The question came from Sarah, her eyes wide. Jedediah's expression hardened into something that looked carved from stone. I'll hold them off as long as I can. Maybe kill enough that the rest lose their taste for it. Maybe not. He headed toward the stairs that led to the upper level. Either way, you follow the plan. He left the main room, his heavy boots echoing as he moved to the external walkways that connected different parts of the fortress, preparing defensive positions he had obviously planned for long before this day. The sisters, suddenly stripped of the confidence they had been building over the past months, felt a resurgence of the raw fear that had driven them from Dead Man's Creek. They secured the doors and windows as Jedediah had instructed, their hands shaking despite their best efforts to remain calm. Clementine was crying again, clutching Sarah's leg. "I don't want Mr. Jedediah to die." "He's not going to die," Margaret said, though she had no basis for that reassurance. "He's too stubborn to die." "We have to help him," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with terror but also with a desperate resolve. "He told us to stay inside." Margaret countered, her voice tight with the effort of maintaining control. "He means to die out there," Beatrice argued, her gaze sweeping Jedediah's impressive arsenal of hunting rifles and shotguns that adorned the walls. "He means to protect us, but he doesn't have to do it alone." She walked to the wall and took down a Winchester repeater. "He trained us, Margaret. He taught us to shoot. He didn't do that for decoration." Indeed, Jedediah, in his pragmatic way, had insisted they learn to handle firearms. He had drilled them on loading, aiming, firing, and most importantly, staying calm under pressure. Margaret had assumed it was for hunting or defending against wild animals. Now she understood it had always been for this. For men, not beasts. The wind picked up, rattling the shutters with increasing violence. Outside, the sky was darkening, promising another heavy snowfall. The mountains were preparing for battle. And then, through the mournful howl of the wind, they heard it. The distant, unmistakable crack of a rifle shot, followed by another, then another in rapid succession. The siege had begun. Outside, hidden among the rocks above the fortress, Jedediah Halt was a phantom in the blizzard. He had positioned himself on a rocky outcrop that overlooked the only viable approach to the cabin. Through the swirling whiteout, he spotted the dark shapes of riders struggling up the trail. He counted them. 12. More than he had hoped, fewer than he had feared. Hard men, desperate men, led by the promise of gold that Phineas Thorne had drunkenly spilled in every saloon between Dead Man's Creek and Helena. Jedediah leveled his Sharps buffalo rifle, resting it on a snow-covered rock to steady his aim. He did not aim for the men, not yet. He aimed for the lead horse. He squeezed the trigger. The heavy .50 caliber slug roared from the barrel with a sound like thunder rolling down the valley. The recoil was substantial, but Jedediah's shoulder absorbed it without flinching. Downrange, the lead horse went down, screaming, throwing its rider into a snowbank and blocking the narrow path. Chaos erupted among the bandits. "Take cover!" a voice roared from below. It was a voice Margaret would have recognized with a chill. Dutch van der Linde. He had not just sent men. He had come himself, driven by greed and perhaps by wounded pride. Bullets began to chip away at the rock around Jedediah. He moved immediately, sliding back into the cover of the trees, relocating to a secondary position he had prepared years ago, just another part of the defensive plan that had existed only in theory until now. He was fighting a war of attrition. He knew the terrain. They did not. He knew every rock, every tree, every possible line of sight. But there were too many of them. Eventually, numbers would tell. Inside the cabin, Margaret paced the floor, the Winchester repeater heavy in her hands. "We can't just wait," she hissed. "If they get past him, they'll burn us out." "He said to stay put," Beatrice cried, huddled near the fireplace with Clementine. "He's one man against a dozen," Sarah said, her voice surprisingly steady, despite the fear evident in her eyes. She was tearing strips of linen from an old sheet with quick, efficient movements. "He's going to get hurt. We need hot water ready, and whiskey for wounds." The gunfire intensified, the sounds echoing off the mountain walls, making it impossible to tell exactly where the fighting was happening. It sounded closer now. Jedediah was falling back, giving ground, drawing them into a killing field he had prepared. Suddenly, the heavy oak door shuddered under a massive impact. Someone was trying to ram it. Jedediah had been flanked. "The window!" Margaret shouted. She rushed to the shuttered window facing the porch and threw it open. A bandit, his teeth bared in a snarl of triumph, was raising a torch to the eaves of the porch, preparing to set the entire structure ablaze. He looked up, surprised to see the young woman he had expected to victimize staring down at him. But his surprise turned to shock as he found himself looking down the barrel of a Winchester rifle. Margaret did not think. She did not hesitate. The image of her uncle selling them the cold march through the mountains, the fear, the helplessness, it all coalesced into a single point of focus. She pulled the trigger. The recoil bruised her shoulder badly, knocking her back a step. But downrange the bandit dropped the torch and fell backward into the snow. He did not move again. "I got one," Margaret whispered, shock washing over her in a cold wave. Her hands began to shake. "They're at the back," Sarah screamed from the kitchen. The sisters sprang into action. It was a scene that defied every convention of the West, every expectation of how young women should behave in the face of danger. These were not damsels in distress waiting to be rescued. They were a cohesive unit forged in the fires of adversity and tempered by weeks of training under a harsh but effective teacher. Beatrice grabbed a shotgun from the wall and aimed it at the kitchen door, which was beginning to splinter under repeated blows from an axe. Sarah positioned herself with a revolver near the root cellar entrance, guarding their escape route. Margaret took up position at the front window, reloading the Winchester with trembling but determined hands. Outside, Jedediah heard the retort of the Winchester from the house. The sound was distinctive, different from his own rifle fired from inside his fortress. They were fighting. The realization sent a surge of something through him, terror mixed with pride, fear, combined with fierce satisfaction. He abandoned his cover and made a desperate dash for the cabin, his Colts blazing, taking down 2 men who were trying to rush the front door. He vaulted the porch railing with surprising agility for a man his size and age. "Open up!" he roared, his voice cutting through the chaos. Margaret unbarred the door, and Jedediah tumbled inside, trailing blood across the polished floor. He kicked the door shut behind him and slammed the heavy iron bolt home just as bullets splintered the wood from outside. "You're hit," Sarah said, rushing to him with her makeshift medical supplies. Jedediah was pale, his breathing labored. A bullet had caught him in the side just above the hip, punching through flesh, but missing vital organs by what looked like less than an inch. Another had grazed his temple, reopening the old scar and sending blood streaming down his face. He slumped against the wall, sliding down until he was sitting on the floor. "Not deep," he wheezed, clutching his side. Blood seeped between his fingers. "But I can't stand. Can't fight from the ground." "Then we fight," Margaret said, her voice stronger than she felt. She looked at her sisters, seeing the same determination reflected in their faces that she felt burning in her chest. "Sarah, patch him up. Keep him alive. Beatrice, you load weapons. Keep them coming. Clementine, you stay low and keep ammunition moving from the stores to us. I'll take the front window." For the next hour, the O'Malley sisters held Devil's Throat. Margaret proved to be a natural marksman, her hands steady despite the fear coursing through her veins, her eye sharp, her timing precise. She picked off anyone foolish enough to break cover, firing with a cold efficiency that surprised even herself. Beatrice reloaded weapons with machine-like efficiency, her hands moving in a blur, never fumbling, never hesitating. She kept a steady stream of loaded rifles and pistols flowing to Margaret. Sarah worked on Jedediah with surprising skill, cleaning the wound, digging out the bullet with a sterilized knife while he bit down on a leather strap. He groaned, but never cried out, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, his body rigid with pain. She packed the wound with clean cloth, bound it tight, and forced him to drink whiskey both for the pain and to sterilize from the inside. The bandits, realizing that the helpless victims they had expected were putting up a fight fiercer than a regiment of cavalry, began to lose their nerve. Bodies lay in the snow. Their numbers were dwindling. The mountain fortress that had seemed like an easy target was proving to be a death trap. When Dutch van der Linde took a bullet to the shoulder from Margaret's rifle fired from 100 yards through falling snow, the gang finally broke. "Retreat," Dutch screamed, clutching his shattered shoulder. "Back to the horses!" Retreat. They fled down the mountain, abandoning their dead, abandoning their wounded, abandoning any thought of gold in favor of the more immediate goal of survival. The sound of hoofbeats and shouting faded into the distance, swallowed by the wind and the vast emptiness of the mountains. Silence returned to the cabin, broken only by the heavy breathing of the sisters, the crackle of the fire, and Jedediah's labored gasps as the pain from his wounds began to truly register now that the immediate danger had passed. Margaret slumped against the wall, the rifle slipping from her fingers to clatter on the floor. She looked at her hands. They were covered in gun oil and soot, and what might have been blood, though she was not sure if it was hers or someone else's. She looked at Jedediah. He was lying on the rug now, bandaged and pale, but his eyes were open. He was watching them with an expression that Margaret could not quite identify. It was not gratitude exactly. It was something deeper, more profound. Recognition, perhaps. Respect. "You didn't listen." He rasped, his voice weak, but carrying a note that might have been amusement. "No," Margaret said, meeting his gaze. "We didn't." "Good," he whispered. He motioned weakly for Margaret to come closer. She knelt beside him, and he fumbled in his vest pocket with his uninjured hand. "Keys," he murmured. "In my pocket. The locked room. Get the laudanum. Top shelf. And the box under the bed." Margaret took the keys with trembling hands. She walked to the forbidden door next to the workbench, the door that had been off-limits since their arrival. Her hand shook as she inserted the key into the lock. The room smelled of lavender and old paper and preserved memories. It was a nursery frozen in time. A dusty crib stood in the corner, its blankets still neatly arranged as if waiting for a child who would never return. A rocking chair sat by the window, and on the walls dozens of drawings, childish sketches of mountains and horses and flowers, each one carefully framed and preserved. It was a shrine to a life stolen, a future that had been murdered along with the woman and child who should have lived it. Margaret found the laudanum on a shelf filled with medical supplies. She also found the wooden box under the bed. It was heavy locked with a smaller key on the same ring. She carried both back to the main room. She handed the laudanum to Sarah, who administered a careful dose to Jedediah. His face relaxed slightly as the opiate began to take effect, easing the pain, if not eliminating it entirely. Then Jedediah placed his hand on the box, his fingers trembling slightly. "Open it," he told them. Margaret unlocked the box. Inside were documents, deeds to the property, mining claims all properly filed and legal, patents for engineering designs, inventions that Jedediah had created and registered. And at the bottom, a marriage certificate. Jedediah Halt and Emily Vance, June 14th, 1868. "I was an engineer," Jedediah said, his voice slurring slightly from the laudanum but still coherent. "Came west to build bridges. The railroad was expanding. Good money. Important work. Found gold instead by accident. Built this place for Emily. Thought we'd be safe here. Thought isolation meant security." He paused, his eyes growing distant. "I was wrong." He looked at Clementine, then at Sarah Beatrice, and finally Margaret. His eyes, usually so hard and unreadable, were suddenly vulnerable, raw with an emotion he had kept buried for years. "I bought you because I saw the same fear in your eyes that I saw in Emily's before she died. The same helplessness, the same certainty of doom." His voice broke slightly. "I thought if I could save you, maybe I could save some part of myself. Maybe I could undo what I failed to do for them." Tears streamed down Beatrice's face, cutting clean tracks through the grime and soot. Sarah was openly sobbing. Even Clementine, who did not fully understand everything being said, was crying. Margaret reached out and took Jedediah's rough, calloused hand in both of hers. "You did save us, Jedediah," she said softly, using his given name for the first time. "And we saved you." He squeezed her hand weakly, then closed his eyes. The laudanum was pulling him toward sleep, toward healing, toward whatever dreams or nightmares awaited him. That night something died in the fortress called Devil's Throat. The ghost that Jedediah Halt had been the phantom of grief and guilt passed away. In its place, Something new was born, not a replacement for what had been lost, that could never be replaced, but something different, something hopeful, a family, broken yes, unconventional certainly, but a family nonetheless. The spring of 1879 brought a thaw that turned the mountain streams into roaring torrents. The snow retreated from Devil's Throat, revealing a valley lush with emerald green grass and dotted with wildflowers that had waited through the long winter for their moment in the sun. Jedediah's recovery was slow and painful. The wound to his hip had damaged something, left him with a permanent limp that forced him to rely on a cane he carved from hickory. For a man who had defined himself by his physical prowess, by his ability to survive anything the wilderness could throw at him, it was a bitter pill. He spent long hours on the porch, watching the sun move across the peaks, brooding on what had been lost and what remained. The sisters gave him space, understanding that some wounds were deeper than flesh and took longer to heal. One evening, as the sun painted the western sky in shades of orange and gold, as the sisters cleared the dinner table, Jedediah cleared his throat in a way that suggested he had something important to say. "Snow's gone," he said gruffly, not looking at any of them directly. "Passes are open." Margaret paused a plate in her hand. "You're free to go." Jedediah continued, his voice carefully neutral. "I'll give you gold. Enough to get to San Francisco or St. Louis or wherever you want. You can have a life. Find husbands, proper ones. Not live in a shack with a cripple on a mountain." The silence in the room was absolute. Sarah looked at Beatrice. Clementine looked at Margaret. The moment stretched heavy with unspoken questions and answers. Margaret set the plate down with a deliberate clatter. She walked around the table and stood directly in front of Jedediah, forcing him to look at her. "Is that what you want?" she asked quietly. "You want us to leave?" Jedediah looked up. His eyes tormented, filled with a pain that had nothing to do with his physical injuries. "I want you to have a future. There's nothing here but rock and memories and a man too broken to be fixed." "You're wrong," Margaret said firmly. She pulled over a chair and sat opposite him. She unrolled a large piece of paper she had been working on for weeks, spreading it across the table. It was a map of the valley drawn with the precision of someone who had learned drafting from studying Jedediah's engineering texts. "Look at this, Jedediah. Really look at it." He frowned, studying the map despite himself. "The gold mine is finite," Margaret said, her finger tracing the veins he had marked on his own mining charts. "You've said so yourself. 5 years, maybe 10, and it'll run dry. But this land, this grass, it's unique. I've been reading your agricultural texts. This is high-altitude fescue. It's nutrient-dense, hardy, perfect for grazing." Jedediah looked at her as if she had lost her mind. "Grass doesn't pay bills, girl." "It does if you have something to eat it," she countered. "There's a breed of sheep, Merino, from Spain. Their wool is soft as silk, and it fetches top dollar in the eastern markets. They thrive in high rocky terrain. They're bred for mountains." She leaned forward, her eyes bright with a vision that had been forming during the long winter months. "This valley isn't a trap, Jedediah. It's a ranch. We don't just survive here. We build something. Something that lasts." "Sheep," Jedediah said flatly, though something in his tone suggested he was considering it despite himself. "This is cattle country. Cattlemen kill sheep herders for sport." "Let them try," Sarah interjected from across the room, calmly polishing the revolver she had claimed as her own. "We seem to be fairly good at handling unwelcome guests." A slow, genuine smile spread across Jedediah's scarred face. It transformed him, erasing years of hardness, revealing the man he might have been if tragedy had not carved away his softer edges. "Empire of wool," he mused. "It's mad, completely mad." "Will you help us?" Margaret asked, holding her breath. Jedediah struggled to his feet, leaning heavily on his cane. He looked at the map, then at Margaret, then at the 3 other girls watching him with hope and determination shining in their eyes. "No," he said. Margaret's heart sank. "I won't help you." Jedediah continued. "We'll do it together, as partners, as—" He paused, searching for the right word, as family. He extended his hand to Margaret. She took it, gripping firmly, sealing a bargain that would change the Montana Territory forever. Outside, the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in colors too beautiful for words. And in the fortress called Devil's Throat, a new chapter began. Not one of survival, but one of building. Not one of mere existence, but one of legacy. The screen would fade to black here, and then a title card would appear, 1879 to 1923, The Building Years. What followed in the years after that handshake was a period of frantic industry that would eventually be recorded in the annals of Montana history, though the telling would come much later and the credit would be distributed far less generously than it deserved. Jedediah liquidated a significant portion of his gold hoard in the spring of 1879, a move that shocked the bankers in Helena. Augustus Pemberton, the head clerk at the First Montana Territorial Bank, actually removed his spectacles and cleaned them twice when Jedediah presented his withdrawal request. "Mr. Halt," Pemberton said carefully, "this is nearly your entire deposit. Might I inquire as to your intentions? Investment advice is part of our service." "Sheep," Jedediah said flatly. Pemberton blinked. "I beg your pardon." "Buying sheep, merino breeding stock, from Spain." The banker's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, disbelief, concern for Jedediah's mental state. "Mr. Halt, this is cattle country. The ranchers will not take kindly to sheep on open range." "Not asking their permission," Jedediah replied, signing the withdrawal papers with his distinctive scrawl. "And it's not open range. It's my land, legally filed and registered." The news spread through Helena like wildfire. Halt's Folly, they called it. The mountain man had finally lost his mind. Gold fever had turned to sheep fever. Men placed bets in saloons on how long it would take before Jedediah was run out of the territory or killed by cattlemen protecting what they saw as their God-given right to graze the public lands. But Jedediah did not buy just any sheep. With Margaret's research and planning, they contacted importers in New York who had connections to the finest breeders in Spain. The merino sheep they ordered were not the common variety. They were bloodline stock animals whose wool was so fine it was reserved for Spanish royalty. The cost was astronomical. The logistics were nightmarish. Transporting 2,000 sheep from Spain to New York, then by rail to the end of the line in Utah, then by wagon and on hoof across hundreds of miles of wilderness to a hidden valley in the Montana Territory, was an undertaking that seemed designed to fail. It took 8 months. 8 months of coordinating shipments, hiring drovers who thought they were being sent to their deaths, navigating customs and tariffs, and the suspicious questions of territorial authorities who wondered why anyone would spend that kind of money on sheep. But in March of 1880, the first of the merino flock arrived at Devil's Throat. They came up the same treacherous mountain trail that the O'Malley sisters had climbed 2 years earlier, bleeding and complaining their fine wool coats matted with trail dust, but their bloodlines intact. Jedediah stood on the porch with his cane watching the seemingly endless stream of sheep fill the valley below. Margaret stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "It's really happening," she whispered, awe evident in her voice. "We're either geniuses or the biggest fools in Montana," Jedediah replied. But he was smiling. The cattle barons mocked them openly. Colton Brennan, who ran the largest cattle operation in the territory, made a point of riding to Devil's Throat that first summer just to laugh at what he saw. "Sheep," he said, spitting tobacco juice into the grass. "In Montana. Halt, you've gone soft in the head. Winter will kill half of them. Wolves will get the rest. And if by some miracle they survive, their wool won't be worth the cost of shearing." Margaret, who had been studying the breeding program with Beatrice, stepped forward. She was 22 years old now, no longer the terrified girl who had been sold in a saloon. She wore a dress of her own weaving, simple but well made, and she carried herself with a confidence that came from surviving things that would have broken lesser people. "Mr. Brennan," she said politely but firmly, We have contracts with textile mills in Boston before we've even sheared the first fleece. The demand for fine merino wool exceeds supply by a factor of 10. We're not competing with cattle. We're in an entirely different market." Brennan stared at her, then at Jedediah, then back at her. He had expected ignorant mountain folk. He had found a businesswoman who understood economics better than he did. "We'll see," he muttered, turning his horse. "We'll just see." They did see. By 1882, the Holt and Sisters Wool Company was producing the finest wool in the American West. Beatrice had crossbred the merino with local hardy breeds, creating a strain that was even more resistant to the brutal Montana winters while maintaining the softness and quality that made merino wool so valuable. Sarah managed the logistics of an operation that had grown to employ 30 workers. Herders, shearers, sorters, packers. She organized them with military efficiency, creating schedules and systems that maximized productivity while maintaining quality. Clementine, now 12 years old, had discovered a talent for design. Her sketches of sheep and mountains became the company logo, a brand mark that appeared on every bale of wool they shipped east. Textile manufacturers began to request the Holt wool, specifically willing to pay premium prices for the consistency and quality. Margaret became the face of the business. She traveled to Boston, to New York, to Philadelphia, negotiating contracts with mill owners who initially tried to dismiss her as a naive frontier woman. They learned quickly. Margaret had inherited her mother's intelligence and combined it with Jedediah's stubborn refusal to be cheated. She secured long-term contracts at prices that made the operation not just profitable, but extraordinarily successful. And Jedediah, he was the architect of the physical infrastructure. He designed automated shearing sheds that reduced the time and labor required. He created a hydraulic dipping system to clean the wool that was years ahead of anything else in the West. He engineered a network of fences and gates that allowed them to manage the flock with minimal manpower. The valley that had once been a fortress of isolation became a thriving operation. They built homes for the workers, simple but solid structures that provided shelter and dignity. They built a school which Beatrice ran, teaching not just the workers' children, but anyone from the surrounding areas who wanted to learn. They built a clinic staffed by Sarah, who had studied every medical text in Jedediah's library and sent away for more. Devil's Throat was no longer just a name. It was becoming a community, a settlement, a place where people wanted to live and work. But success bred envy, and envy bred danger of a different kind than bandits with guns. In the summer of 1882, a man arrived at the ranch with a sheriff and a court order. His name was Cyrus Thorne, and he claimed to be a distant cousin of Phineas. The resemblance was there in the weasel-like features and the calculating eyes, though Cyrus was better dressed and carried himself with the confidence of a man who had money and connections. "I'm here to claim water rights to the creek that feeds your operation," Cyrus announced, presenting documents that looked official and legal. "This deed dates back 20 years. Prior claim. The law is clear. Without water, your sheep operation is finished." It was a clever move. Without the creek, the valley would support only a fraction of the flock. The entire enterprise would collapse, and Cyrus clearly had plans to buy the land for pennies once they were desperate. Jedediah reached for his rifle, but Margaret put a hand on his arm. "No," she said quietly. "Not this time." She walked onto the porch, dressed in a tailored wool suit of her own company's manufacture, carrying a leather portfolio. She looked like a lawyer, which, in a sense, she had become through years of studying land law and water rights. "Get off my land, Mr. Thorne," she said calmly. "This is a legal matter, little lady." Cyrus sneered, his tone dripping with condescension. "The law says this water is mine." "Actually," Margaret said, opening her portfolio, "the law says you are trespassing on federal land granted under the Homestead Act of 1862 and confirmed under the Mining Act of 1872. Water rights were grandfathered to the original claim holder, Mr. Jedediah Holt, in 1869. Furthermore, I have here a telegraph from the territorial governor confirming our grazing rights for the next 99 years. She stepped forward, her eyes cold and hard. "We did not just build a ranch, Mr. Thorne. We built a corporation. We have lawyers, good ones, better than yours. And we have documentation for every claim, every right, every legal protection that exists under territorial and federal law." She handed him a packet of papers. "These are copies of our filings. You'll find everything in order. You'll also find a notice of our intent to sue for harassment and malicious prosecution if you ever set foot on this property again without invitation." Cyrus looked at the papers, then at the sheriff, who had gone very quiet. The lawman had ridden out expecting to serve a simple water rights claim on ignorant ranchers. He had found a legal fortress as impenetrable as the physical one. The sheriff cleared his throat. "Mr. Thorne, it appears their documentation is in order. I cannot enforce your claim." Cyrus looked past Margaret to where Jedediah stood leaning on his cane, but with a rifle within easy reach. The mountain man's face was impassive, but his eyes promised violence if Cyrus pushed this beyond the courts. Then Cyrus looked at the armed vaqueros that Margaret had hired to guard the flockmen who were loyal to the Holt operation and who would defend it if needed. He tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy, though his face was flushed with anger and humiliation. "This isn't over." "Yes," Margaret said quietly. "It is." Cyrus stared at her for another moment, then turned his horse without a word. Cyrus Thorne rode away that day and never returned. The story of how a young woman had defeated a land grab using nothing but law books and preparation spread through the territory. It enhanced the reputation of the Holt and Sisters Wool Company, but more importantly, it established them as a force to be respected, not dismissed. The years that followed were years of steady growth and consolidation. What had begun as an audacious gamble became an established enterprise. By 1885, the operation had expanded beyond anyone's initial vision. The valley now held over 50,000 sheep. The wool company was the largest supplier of fine wool in the western states. They had contracts with mills in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and even exporters who shipped to England. But more than the commercial success they had created, something that mattered in a deeper way. The town of Holt Sanctuary, as it came to be called, was a thriving community of over 3,000 people. It had electric street lamps, powered by a hydroelectric system Jedediah had engineered using the same creek that Cyrus had tried to claim. It had a public library named the Beatrice O'Malley Athenaeum, filled with thousands of books. It had the finest hospital in the territory, founded and run by Dr. Sarah O'Malley, who had eventually gone to medical school in the East and returned with a degree that made her one of the few female physicians in Montana. And it had families, children, a future. The mountain man who had once bought 4 girls to save them from a worse fate had in turn been saved by them. He had given them a home. They had given him a legacy. The years passed as years do, with a speed that seems impossible when you are young, but inevitable when you grow old. The turn of the century came and went. Montana achieved statehood. The railroad finally reached Holt Sanctuary, bringing the world closer, but never quite close enough to destroy the character of the place. The year was 1923. The world outside the Absaroka Mountains had changed irrevocably. The Great War in Europe had come and gone, taking with it the innocence of a generation. Automobiles now rattled down the streets of Helena, and airplanes flew overhead machines that would have seemed like magic to the people of 1878. But high in the valley of Devil's Throat, time seemed to move at a different pace, more dignified, more connected to the rhythms of seasons and generations than to the frantic rush of modernity. The rough fortress of logs and mud was gone, encased within, and expanded into a sprawling, magnificent manor house of stone and timber that rivaled the great estates of the East Coast. It was not ostentatious, but it was substantial, built to last for generations, just as Jedediah had built everything in his life. On the wide veranda of the manor overlooking a valley, now dotted with the white forms of sheep and the neat buildings of a prosperous operation, an old man sat in a wheelchair. His hair was white as the snow on the peaks above, and his face was a map of deep canyons and weathered ridges carved by 90 years of living. The famous scar was barely visible now, lost in the wrinkles and age spots that marked the passage of time. Jedediah Holt was 89 years old. His body had betrayed him gradually over the years, the hip injury from the siege eventually requiring the wheelchair, but his mind remained sharp, his eyes still capable of seeing the details that others missed. Margaret sat beside him in a rocking chair. She was 65 now, her hair silver, but her posture remained as regal as it had been when she first stood up to Cyrus Thorne 4 decades earlier. She held Jedediah's hand, the hand that had once been strong enough to kill a man with a single blow, now frail and trembling with age. "The train is late." Jedediah rasped his voice, a shadow of the thunder it once was. "The train is on time, Jedediah," Margaret said gently, adjusting the blanket over his legs against the autumn chill. "Beatrice and Clementine are coming up from the station in the motor car. They will be here soon." Jedediah grunted a sound that managed to convey both skepticism and acceptance. Noisy contraptions. Horses were better. Margaret smiled. It was an old argument, one they had been having for years. Jedediah distrusted most modern inventions, though he had designed many of them himself. He looked out at the valley, his eyes tracking the movements of the herders and the sheep with the practiced gaze of someone who had spent a lifetime understanding this land. "Did we get the price we wanted from the English buyers?" Margaret had been expecting this question. Jedediah asked it at least once a day, now his memory starting to slip in small ways, though the core of who he was remained intact. "We did. Top market value. They say there is not a finer weave in the British Empire than Holt wool." "Good," he whispered. "Good." He closed his eyes, and for a moment Margaret thought he had drifted off to sleep. But then he spoke again, his voice so quiet she had to lean in to hear. "Margaret, I'm here. Do you remember the cold that first night in the cave?" Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes. "I remember. I was so angry then." Jedediah's lips curved into something that might have been a smile. "I was angry too, angry at God, angry at the world, angry at myself for living when they died." He paused, gathering strength. "Then you 4 showed up, scared little rabbits." He chuckled, a dry rattling sound. "Turned out to be wolves in disguise." "You taught us how to bite," Margaret said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "No," he breathed. "You always had teeth. I just showed you where to aim." The distant rumble of an automobile sounded in the driveway. Margaret looked up to see a Ford Model T approaching, dust rising behind it in the afternoon sun. Beatrice emerged first, now a distinguished scholar whose papers on animal husbandry had been published in journals across the country. She wore spectacles and moved with the careful precision of someone who lived in a world of books and ideas. Clementine came next, and even at 51 years old she carried herself with the grace of an artist. Her paintings of the American West hung in galleries in Paris and New York. She had captured the spirit of the mountains in ways that photographs never could, painting not just what was there, but what it felt like to be there. Sarah came from the house wiping her hands on a medical apron. At 59, she was still the head physician at the hospital that bore the family name. She had trained a generation of doctors and nurses, and her clinic had saved countless lives over the decades. They gathered around Jedediah, the 4 sisters, the women who had built an empire from nothing but determination and wool. They were all here now, surrounding the man who had saved them and whom they had in turn saved. Jedediah opened his eyes one last time. He looked at each of them in turn, his gaze clear and lucid, not seeing the wealthy matrons they had become, but the shivering girls in the snow, holding on to each other for dear life, facing an uncertain future with nothing but each other. "My girls," he whispered. And then Jedediah Halt, the ghost of Absaroka, the mountain man who had been broken by tragedy and rebuilt by love, closed his eyes and simply stopped breathing. There was no struggle, no pain, just a quiet exhalation like the wind settling after a storm. The mountain wind picked up at that moment, rustling through the pine trees, singing a dirge for the man who had tamed it. The sheep in the valley below seemed to pause in their grazing, as if they too sensed that something fundamental had changed. Margaret held his hand for a long time, unwilling to let go, knowing that when she did, an era would truly end. But finally, gently, she released him and stood. "He's gone," she said simply. The funeral was the largest Montana had ever seen. The governor attended traveling from the new capital in Helena. Senators came from Washington recognizing the economic impact that the Holt and Sisters Wool Company had made on the state's development. Newspaper reporters from New York and Chicago arrived to document the passing of a legend. But more importantly, hundreds of people lined the streets of Holt Sanctuary, orphans from the Holt Foundation Homes, an organization the sisters had funded for decades, providing shelter and education to children who had no one else. Workers from the wool operation, men and women who had built lives and families on the prosperity that Jedediah and the sisters had created. Teachers from the schools, doctors from the hospital, merchants from the town. They came not because Jedediah Holt was famous, though he was. They came because he had built something that mattered. He had created a place where people could thrive, where children could grow up safe, where hard work was rewarded and dignity was preserved. Phineas Thorne was not mentioned during the funeral. He had died 30 years earlier, freezing to death in a gutter in Deadwood, South Dakota, penniless and alone, a footnote that history had already erased. No one mourned him. No one remembered him. His only legacy was the 4 nieces he had sold, and they had long since transcended anything he could have imagined. After the burial on a hill overlooking the valley with a view of the mountains that had been Jedediah's home for over 50 years, the sisters gathered in the great library of the manor for the reading of the will. The family attorney was a young man named Harrison Fletcher, barely 30 years old, but he had been chosen carefully by Jedediah years earlier. He looked nervous as he broke the seal on the heavy envelope, aware that what he was about to read would be witnessed by some of the most powerful women in Montana. Mr. Holt updated his will many times over the years as the business grew. Harrison began his voice steady despite his nerves. But there was one document he insisted be kept sealed until his death. He wrote it in the winter of 1879, had it notarized in secret the following spring, and forbade anyone from reading it before today. The sisters exchanged glances. 1879, the year of the siege, the year they had truly become a family. He leaves the entirety of the Holt and Sisters Wool Company, all land holdings, all mining rights, and his personal fortune to be divided equally among you, Harrison read. But he wanted you to have this. Harrison pulled out a yellowed, fragile piece of paper, handling it with the care one might give to a holy relic. He handed it to Margaret. Her hands shook as she unfolded it. It was a legal petition signed by Judge Cornelius Miller of the Montana Territorial Court, dated March 15, 1880. Petition for adoption. Petitioner Jedediah Samuel Holt. Adoptees: Margaret Elizabeth O'Malley, Beatrice Ann O'Malley, Sarah Catherine O'Malley, Clementine Rose O'Malley. Status approved and sealed. Margaret's vision blurred with tears as she read Jedediah's handwriting at the bottom of the page, a note scrawled in ink that had faded to brown over the decades. I bought them as servants. I kept them as students. I love them as daughters. But I will not chain them with my name unless they choose it. This paper makes them mine by law to protect them if I die. But if I live, let this sit in the dark. They are O'Malley's. They are strong. They do not need a father to define them, but God knows I needed them. The room was silent except for the sound of crying. Beatrice sobbed openly, her scholarly composure completely shattered. Sarah stared out the window at Jedediah's grave on the hill, tears streaming down her face. Clementine buried her face in her hands. Margaret ran her thumb over the signature over the official seal, over the date that proved Jedediah had legally adopted them 43 years ago and never told them. He had given them the protection of his name in law, but he had never forced them to carry it in life. He thought he was giving us freedom, Margaret whispered, her voice breaking. He did not know. Did not know what? Harrison asked gently. Margaret looked up, tears streaming down her face, but smiling through them. That we would have been proud to take his name. That we would have chosen it if he had asked. That being a Holt would have been an honor, not a chain. She folded the document carefully and held it against her chest. He saved us from being sold. He protected us from the world. He taught us to be strong. And all that time, he thought we would want to escape him. The four sisters sat together in the library for hours after Harrison left, talking about memories, sharing stories, crying and laughing in the way that only people who have survived impossible things together can do. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in the colors that Clementine had captured in 1,000 paintings, they made a decision together. The story of the O'Malley sisters and the Mountain Man became legend in Montana and beyond. Books were written, some accurate, many not. But the truth was simpler and more profound than any fiction could capture. They never married, any of them. They dedicated their lives to the wool company, to the town, to the thousands of orphans they saved with their fortune. They built schools and hospitals, libraries and homes. They created opportunities for people who had none, just as Jedediah had created an opportunity for them. On the archway of the cemetery, where they were eventually laid to rest, beside Jedediah one by one as the years took them, there is a plaque that remains to this day, bronze and weathered, but still legible. It reads, "Here lies Jedediah Halt, 1834 to 1923, and his four beloved daughters, Margaret, 1858 to 1942, Beatrice, 1861 to 1945, Sarah, 1864 to 1943, and Clementine, 1872 to 1951. He bought them for gold, but he paid for them with his heart. And together they built a legacy that time cannot erode. But the legacy was not just in buildings or businesses or money, though those things mattered. The legacy was in the lives changed in the children, saved in the idea that family is not just blood, but choice and commitment and love that transcends circumstance. In 1962, long after all of them had passed, the Manor House became a museum. The Holt and O'Malley sisters' historical foundation preserved it exactly as it had been, down to the locked room that had been Jedediah's shrine to Emily and Clara, now open to show visitors the pain that had driven a man to isolation and the love that had brought him back. On the wall of the museum, there is a reproduction of the adoption papers enlarged so visitors can read Jedediah's note. And next to it, in Margaret's handwriting, dated the day after his funeral, is a response that was found in her personal papers after her death. "Dear Jedediah, you wrote that we did not need a father to define us. You were wrong. We needed you not to define us, but to show us what we could become. You thought you were broken beyond repair. But broken things, when mended, are often stronger at the broken places. We were your mending, and you were ours. We would have been honored to be Halts in name as we were in heart. But we understand now that you gave us something better than a name. You gave us the freedom to choose our own path while knowing we always had a home to return to. That is the greatest gift a father can give. We miss you. We will always miss you. But your work continues in every child we save, in every life we change, in every person who finds hope where there was none. You built more than a fortress in the mountains. You built a future, and we promise to guard it as fiercely as you guarded us. Your daughters forever, Margaret, Beatrice, Sarah, and Clementine." The afternoon sun streams through the windows of the museum, now illuminating the photographs on the walls. Jedediah in his prime, stern and scarred, but with kind eyes. The four sisters at various ages, growing from frightened girls to confident women. The sheep in the valley, the workers in the sheds, the children in the schools, and visitors who come to see this piece of history, this fragment of the Old West that somehow survived into the modern age, often leave with tears in their eyes. Not because the story is sad, though there is sadness in it, but because it is true. Because it proves that redemption is possible, that broken people can heal, that love, the real kind, the kind that requires sacrifice and commitment and the willingness to be changed, can transform everything it touches. The ghost of Absaroka is gone now, along with the four sisters who tamed him. But the mountains remain, the valley remains, the legacy remains. And in the evening, when the wind blows down from the peaks and through the pines, some say you can still hear echoes, not of gunfire or violence or fear, but of laughter, of a family that chose each other against all odds, of a mountain man and 4 girls who built something that even time, that great destroyer, cannot completely erase. The wool empire eventually faded. Markets changed. Synthetic fabrics replaced natural ones. The great ranches of the West gave way to other industries. But the town of Holt Sanctuary survived, smaller now, but still they're still carrying the name, still home to people who know the story and tell it to their children. And every year on the anniversary of Jedediah's death, people gather at his grave on the hill. They place wildflowers there, the same kind that grow in the valley below. They stand in silence for a moment, remembering a man who was called a ghost, but who proved to be more human than most. They remember 4 girls who were sold like cattle, but who rose to build an empire. They remember that the measure of a person is not where they start, but what they do with what they are given. And they remember that family, real family, is built not on blood alone, but on the choices we make, the people we protect, the love we give, even when we think we have nothing left to give. The story ends here, as all stories must. But the truth it tells, the hope it offers, the proof it provides, that even the most broken among us can be made whole, that endures. That is the legacy of the ghost of Absaroka and the 4 daughters who saved him by letting him save them. That is the weight of gold measured not in coins, but in lives changed. That is what remains when everything else has turned to dust.